And that brings us to In Focus tonight. And we are discussing this. India-Australia, a shared comprehensive vision. India-Australia, a shared comprehensive vision. To discuss this, we have two eminent guests, Ambassador Manjeep Puri, former senior diplomat, and Professor Swaran Singh from the School of International Studies at JNU. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us. Professor Swaran Singh, you did mention about the potential for people movement, and you did talk about how it's risen also. In fact, our ambassador in Australia has said it's about 7.5 lakh people of Indian origin there. So mobility of people, recognition of university degrees, and what Ambassador Manjeep Puri has just been talking about. I mean, people can move from there to other parts of the world as well. How would you look at this developing over the next few years?
Thank you, Mark, for asking this question, because I come from education sector, and I take deep interest in opportunities for Indian students that are provided in some of these advanced countries who have very, very competent universities. And I just mentioned earlier how numbers of Indian students have shot up in about last 5 years. Now, it is a result of that kind of explosion of Indian students showing interest in Australian universities that they have decided to set up a task force to explore what would be the qualifications to begin to recognize each other's degrees. And that's a great leap forward in that sense. And not just that, in fact, the task force is also going to look at possibilities of joint degrees by Indian and Australian universities, online learning using resources from both Australia and India. For example, Australian National University, which I am familiar, I spent some time there, uses enormous amount of people from across the world as on their panel. They are not employees of ANU, but they use them as visiting professors very often. Right. So how could that opportunities of exchange of teachers and students could take place? And of course, offshore campuses. India is requiring enormous amount of expansion of education sector, and that kind of offshore campuses from both sides could open up a very different kind of networking between education sector of two sides. Right. And all of us believe that the youth of any nation, and India is a very young country, decides the future trends of how the world will be moving forward. And if both sides begin to engage each other's students who will be future leaders, I think that's a very, very timely and very well thought of initiative to connect education sector on both sides, which is very interestingly being used as a phrase of education and innovation. Now that means the focus is going to be not just in disbursing degrees, but also promoting frontiers of knowledge in various disciplines across various sort of fields of study. True. And that, I think, is a great opening for Indian universities who can really partner with some of the very important universities in Australia. And likewise, cooperate and complement with each other.
Professor Swaran Singh, so the relationship, both Prime Ministers talked about the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which is still being worked out. And what do you think? I mean, trade and commerce is extremely important, but if we have to look at investment flows, investment from Australia to India has been $15 billion and India to Australia $13 billion. So basically it looks more or less balanced, but the point is that there is significant scope to move northwards. What do you think? I mean, first of all, investment has to come and then trade and commerce improves, isn't it?
Thank you, Mark. I think there is definitely a great deal of potential of both Australia and India beginning to expand their bilateral trade and investments. And that is itself very much visible in the trilateral, this resilience initiative, which is Japan, Australia and India. Yes. And those ministers had a meeting earlier last week. But we understand that pandemic has overtaken their attention in last 2 years, which has also in that sense diverted their attention as to which are the important areas. So for example, their coming together in Quad itself has showcased how much they want to focus on production and distribution of vaccines, which is part of economy and production and cooperation, where the last leg of distribution will be done by Australia. India will be producing these materials by United States, funding by Japan in that sense. So there are new areas emerging where two countries are beginning to cooperate and expand cooperation and investment.
Yes.
Of course, I'm sure investments will also expand because the greater interest on both sides is very much visible. And I understand that the diaspora has really expanded in last 10 years from 3 lakh to almost 6.6 lakh now.
Yes, yes.
I come from education sector, and to me that trend is reflection of where the relationship is going in terms of economic relationship and people to people relationship. Because of this whole tightening up of visa regimes in the United States under President Donald Trump, we saw enormous numbers increasing in Indian students going to Australia in last almost 5 years, from 2015 to pre-pandemic figures that we have, is from 15,000 to almost 35,400 students. And that has made Australia a very attractive destination because it allows part-time jobs to be done up to 20 hours a day, 20 hours a week by students. Then it allows 2 years of work visa, extended,
Yes.
which is extendable by 4 years. So in that sense, the goodwill, you remember about 5 to 6 years ago, there were some incidents where Indian diaspora had become a bit concerned about Australia. Since then, there is an enormous transformation in how Australia is engaging Indian diaspora, and that should create enormous potential. I understand there are some of the expectations of clinching some of the elements this time in this summit of Australian investments in India are now kind of postponed.
Right.
But I think the fact that they have institutionalized this to be an annual summit
Yes.
means that stock taking will now happen on annual basis, and it's something which is delayed, but it's not disappeared from the table of discussion, that they will expand their mutual.
Professor Swaran Singh, what about the agreement between Prasar Bharati and the Special Broadcasting Service of Australia? How do you look at this? Because from the point of view of laying foundations for the two countries to understand each other in terms of culture, in terms of news streams, the way we look at the world, and there's commonality in terms of language as well. And the Indian diaspora also has Indian content.
I think, Mark, you have answered partly your question.
Okay.
When you want to engage a country, in terms of enormous mutual understanding and trust, then the narratives have to be really, made available to each other as to not just in terms of business deals, but understanding the soft sectors, for example, culture, education, all kinds of traditions, folklore, music. And that, I think, broadcasting brings to bear in that sense, in availing each other's broadcasting facilities and platforms. And that would create kind of a deeper understanding on both sides of how Australians think, what are the important areas for Australians. For example, in RCEP negotiations, the dairy products of Australia were becoming an issue for India to accept the terms of how RCEP was conceived of. But now this kind of regular availability of, for example, Australian Broadcasting Corporation in India or Doordarshan in case of Australia, that perhaps kind of cooperation could lead to joint production as well. But I think even access and availability of each other's channels to begin with could make much more impact in creating constituencies on both sides so that people on the ground understand each other much better. In taking that relationship forward and creating that kind of base groundswell kind of support systems in both sides, which will push that kind of closer relationship with each other. And therefore, I think that's an important initiative. But equally important initiative also, I think, includes in several other sectors where they are trying to create important, strong foundations of relationship, which might see some results in the coming times. And the comprehensive economic partnership agreement could be another area where you will see that they will find much more complementary relationship evolving with each other. Overall, Australia has been looking west, India is looking east. So in that sense, I think the overlap is constantly expanding. Need is to make each other understand where complementarities and partnerships can be built now.